The British economy is collapsing. Hundreds of thousands of people have taken to the streets demanding accountability. People are angry that their country is collapsing. They cannot possibly find a job. And it doesn't seem like everything will recover anytime soon. And if you listen to the media, sometimes it seems like it's all the faults of the immigrants. And they have a very good point. If you look at the statistics, it's very clear that over the last 30 years, the UK has received a lot of immigrants. Millions of people have flooded the UK. And that's why, by looking at this graph alone, it might look like the plan of the government is to replace the native population. However, if you dig down into the problems of the UK, you will find out that the immigrants are the scapegoats, and the situation is way worse than most people imagine. Let's take a look at another statistics. If you look at the government's tax revenues over the last 20 years, you will quickly see that they haven't actually been growing much. For example, in 2005, the British government has received around £400 billion, which seems like a lot of money. By 2019, that number has grown to £600,000, which is a 50% increase. But by looking at this, it might seem, yes, the British government is doing a good job. However, let's take a look at how much the British government has been spending over the exact same course. And you'll quickly see a problem. In 2005, the government's tax revenues were about £520 billion. By 2019, that number has grown by 830. Now, if you compare these two numbers, you will quickly see a very easy and simple pattern that the British government over this entire course of time has been overspending. Now, the real question is, where do you get the money that you don't have? Where do you get your money that you don't have? Maybe a credit card, maybe a mortgage, maybe a car loan. And what do we call that? A debt. Exactly. The British government over the last 30 years has been over-relying on debt, especially after the 2008 financial crisis when everything crashed. The British government realized that if we are not going to bail out the entire economy, we are going to fall behind everyone else, and we will no longer be one of the largest economies in the world. I mean, today the British economy is not like second or third or fourth. It's far behind even Japan. It's like what? The sixth largest economy? But if it did not bail out its economy today, it might not even be in the top 10 largest economies. So the major problem that the British government faced over the last 30 years is that we are spending more than we are earning. What do you think is the solution when you are actually spending more than you're earning? It's very easy. It's very straightforward. You don't have to be a genius to come out with that solution. And that's you start earning as much money as you're spending. Or of course, you should just cut your spending, which would be the most logical and the normal thing to do. But it seems like in today's world, people do not want to downgrade their lives. I mean, you can do that on your personal level, but when we are talking about the government should be accountable. Imagine tomorrow the British government will say, we're going to cut the funding for NHS, for example, or we will stop paying pensions for a certain number of people. Do you think people will be happy about that? Do you think people will be re-elected? I mean, people are not even getting re-elected in the UK. I mean, the average lifespan of a prime minister is like, what, a year, 2, 3? That is in the best case scenario. I mean, some people stay there literally for a couple of months. But anyways, in order to grow your revenues, in order to grow the tax revenues, you have to understand how the tax revenues work in the UK in the first place. This is where the British government gets its money from. And you can quickly see that 3 sources of revenues are the major sources for the UK government. Number 1, it's the income tax. Secondly, NIC. And thirdly, value-added tax. Now, income tax is the exact same income tax that you pretty much pay almost everywhere across the globe. In the UK or in the US, we have the normal income tax. All across the globe, in every single European country or developed country, you have an income tax. The second way or the second source of income is NIC, and that's pretty much like the national insurance contribution, which is very similar to what you pay in the US as a payroll tax, and most countries do have that as well. And the third source of income is value-added tax. Now, value-added tax is very similar to a sales tax, but the only difference between them is that, this is a huge difference, by the way, that a sales tax is paid at the end of the day when the final product is sold. But the value-added tax is paid at every stage of the production. So you make far more money from value-added tax than you make from a sales tax. So these three sources of revenue are the major sources for the British government. So now let's imagine, put yourself in the shoes of the British government. They're sitting there and they're thinking, how can we grow the revenues of the government? And they look at this graph, they're like, can we tax the corporations more? Well, corporations aren't paying much of taxes. They literally just represent 11%. Yes, 11% is a huge number. I'm not arguing against that. But if you compare it to these three, then it's not literally that big of a deal. And if we start taxing the corporations more, so many millionaires, so many rich people, so many businesses have already left the UK. If we tax them more rich people will leave the UK. There are so many places all across the globe where you can move and live a far better life. So we're not going to touch the corporations, especially they're the ones who are funding our campaigns or political campaigns. Otherwise, we won't get re-elected. So they came up with a brilliant plan. We are going to take people, or we are going to help people from all across the globe to come to the UK and get employed. So we will make this process much easier and much more legal. When they get to the UK, they will find a job and they will have an income. And we are going to tax this income. That is the most brilliant plan that you can possibly come up with. And that's how we are going to force people to pay more taxes. When you get a job, you gotta pay income tax. When you get a job, you have to pay NIC. And at the end of the day, if you want to live, you have to spend money. You're going to go to Tesco, you're going to buy stuff, you're going to order yourself a cab, you will get yourself a car, you will buy a house, you will do all sorts of things, and you will have to pay a value-added tax. So if we don't have a solution to grow the economy, we can use a quick solution. Just try to attract talent, or at least people who want to find a job and have a decent life. Let's just get them to the UK. Let them just pay taxes in the UK. And that's exactly, if you look at the number of immigration to the UK, it started growing dramatically. And that's because the UK government purposely made it easier for people to come to the UK, for the British economy not to collapse, for the British government not to collapse. People have been paying taxes in order to have a good pension. And now 30 years later, we can look into the eyes of these people and tell them, you've been paying pensions, but we took that money. We don't even know how we spend that money. So yeah, you know what? You're not going to receive your pension. You cannot possibly do that as a government. Otherwise, there is going to be like a revolution tomorrow. And that's why you simply bring more people who are going to pay those taxes. You take this money and you pay the pensions for people. And that takes me to the crisis of 2020. If you look at the number of tax revenues in 2020, suddenly you see that there is a real decline from over 600 billion pounds to 556. Well, at first glance, it doesn't seem like a big deal. So what? Maybe we had a crisis and now we just made less money. There was something called pandemic. Haven't you heard about that? But let's, on the other side, look at the government's revenue. And suddenly you see that government's revenue skyrocketed to 1.1 trillion pounds. Suddenly, imagine you are spending 100% more than you are earning. Imagine you're making like $100,000 and you're spending $200,000. Do you think you are in trouble? You are definitely in trouble. You are in a very big trouble. You will have to pay that money back, and that money has interest. And most likely that was like not a long-term debt, it was a short-term debt. And that's why even if you look at the structure of the British government's bonds, you will quickly see that in 2020 and 2021, most of the British government's debt was short-term debt, so 2-year government bonds. And usually they have a much higher interest rate. And usually when you don't have the money to pay them back, you're refinancing them now later on when interest rates have risen, and now the cost of servicing those debts suddenly grow. Now, the question is, when you have such a problem, your spending is increasing dramatically, but your revenues aren't growing as much as you're spending. What do you do in this case? The solution is very simple and very straightforward. You ask people or you invite people from all across the globe to immigrate to the UK. And that's why you see that immigration to the UK has skyrocketed in 2020. And that's because the British government made it easier for people to migrate to the UK. Why? Because the UK needs these people to pay taxes. So it's not the fault. I'm not trying to make a case for the immigrants or a case against the immigrants. I'm not saying it is good or bad. I'm simply telling you or explaining to you how the British government decided to fix a problem when they mismanaged the finances of the entire country. You see, if the British government was a bit smarter and they realized how money works, how finances works, instead of overspending, they would have taken that money and they have invested that money wisely so that the government has a balanced budget and has some really great investments where money is pouring into the government's revenue. So even if there is a crisis, they could have used those investments in order to pay for this emergency times. But instead, the British government mismanaged all of their finances. And that's why if you don't want to find yourself in such a situation, maybe it's time for you to think. Because as we can see that the British economy is not going to be fixed anytime soon, even if you stop all of this migration to the UK. And that's why you have to take a different action. You should start investing, especially if you are in the UK. But it doesn't matter. If you are in the UK, if you are in the US, if you are wherever you are, it doesn't matter. Because at the end of the day, if you are not investing wisely, you will find yourself in the exact same situation that the British economy is right now. If you haven't started investing, or if you're investing and you haven't yet made your first $100,000 or your first $1 million, there is the first link in the description of this video. Go and check it out. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next one.